Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And my job is to welcome all of you to our lecture today, which features our 2018-2019 Greenberg Research Fellow, Lukas Meissel. So because this is the Greenberg Fellow lecture, I would be remiss if I didn't start the lecture by acknowledging the generosity of Doug and Margie Greenberg, who endowed this fellowship at the center for PhD candidates to spend 1 month in residence at the center conducting research with the Visual History Archive. The Greenberg Fellowship was the first endowed fellowship at the center and holds a special place in our hearts because of that, and also because of the Greenbergs' long relationship with the Shoah Foundation. So let me tell you a little bit about Lukas before he starts. He is a PhD candidate in Holocaust Studies at Haifa University in Israel. His research interests focus on visual history, perpetrator studies, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust education. He holds a BA in history and an MA in contemporary history from the University of Vienna. He previously worked as a historian in the archives of the Jewish community of Vienna, as a guide at the Mauthausen Memorial, and as a project worker for Yad Vashem in Vienna. He has published 7 journal articles and over a dozen encyclopedia entries, which is pretty remarkable for someone at his stage of career. And he was the recipient of the 2017 Yad Vashem Scholarship. And as I mentioned before, he's our 2018-2019 Greenberg Research Fellow. So please join me in welcoming Lukas Meissel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present my topic here today at USC. I feel very privileged that I was awarded the Greenberg Research Fellowship, and I want to thank everyone, especially at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, for your support and help. Today I will talk about the topic of my PhD project that focuses on photographic practices in Nazi concentration camps, specifically photographs taken by SS men. I will present preliminary conclusions and my approaches, as well as recent findings from the Visual History Archive at the Shoah Foundation. As this is just the beginning of my work with oral history interviews in my PhD project, I am not able to present in-depth analysis of testimonies yet. However, I want to point out their potential as complementary sources for the study of visual sources, concretely for the study of perpetrators. In a first step, I will present the visual context and the historical matrix of SS photographs from concentration camps and show selected pictures. Then, I will discuss their potential as historical sources and my main assumptions and approaches towards researching these perpetrator documents. Throughout the presentation, I will refer to recent findings of my stay that I found during my stay here at the Shoah Foundation. The visual history of the Holocaust is formative in the public memory of the camps. There are many pictures that are commonly associated with the Holocaust. Here are a few examples that you're probably familiar with. All these photos have in common that they were not taken in active Nazi concentration camps, but rather after the liberation by Allied photographers, or even years after the Holocaust by tourists. They are taken on the authentic place of a camp, but not during its existence. Nevertheless, these pictures became symbols of the Holocaust or the Nazi terror in general. Historian Cornelia Brink described them as secular icons, and they are often immediately recognized as visualizations of the Holocaust. The history of their establishment as symbols for the Holocaust starts before the crimes of the Nazis were even named by that term. Charles Weil, who served in the 42nd Infantry Division, the so-called Rainbow Division, participated in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. In his Shoah Foundation interview, Weil recalls that many pictures were taken by American soldiers at the liberated camp. However, when GIs wanted to develop their pictures in Munich, all photos that documented atrocities disappeared at the photo store. Therefore, Weil used pictures from his division's commemorative book, among them this example, to illustrate his own memory, therefore merging his subjective experience with the story of his unit and using someone else's photographs as evidence for his own memory, a phenomenon that is very widespread in oral history interviews, including the collections of the Shoah Foundations. But this is a topic of itself. I will not deal with post-war photos and questions of memory and photography in depth in my thesis. Although the story of relatively well-known liberator photos is not disconnected from the time of the active concentration camps, I focus on documents created by perpetrators rather than liberators or victims. Therefore, in my research, I deal with very different photographs to these well-known post-liberation images, namely pictures that were taken by SS men in Nazi concentration camps. My time frame is 1933 until 1945. However, my focus is mainly on the years 1936 onwards. To narrow my topic down, I will focus entirely on, as I call it, institutionalized perpetrator photography in the camps. Meaning photographs that were taken by SS photographers who actually worked in the camps. This excludes photos that were privately taken by individuals and the rare cases of prisoner photography in camps. I will further focus on the so-called Erkennungsdienste, in English identification departments, because officially only SS men who worked or who were associated with these departments were allowed to photograph in the camps, at least after 1936. I will start now by talking briefly about the visual context of these specific pictures to explain their conditions of emergence. Photographs of Nazi concentration camps started to be taken right after the Nazis had seized power in Germany in 1933. The first photos, which were produced for Nazi-affiliated newspapers, were supposed to present the camps as re-education facilities. This example from the end of July 1933 shows the first page of a photo report about the Dachau concentration camp. The existence of the camps was promoted by the regime and not denied. However, the emphasis was on showing them as places of confinement of the political opposition, to be precise, of the left opposition, and as re-education facilities. In this first phase of the history of the Nazi concentration camps, the photos were usually taken by photojournalists who visited the camp rather than SS photographers. However, and this is of high significance to my project, these early photos prove that official photography in concentration camps fulfilled specific functions from the beginning. In the process of standardization of the system of concentration camps by the SS in the following years, the motives of the pictures changed according to the respective function of the camps. Special photography departments, these are now these identification departments, were founded inside the camps in 1936. These departments consisted of a small number of SS men and prisoners who had to work there. Until today, I haven't found any women or female SS associates who worked in these departments. Only these SS photographers were usually allowed to take pictures, and the prisoners, many of whom were actually professional photographers, were forced to assist. My PhD project consists of 3 main chapters. One will be an investigation of these SS photographers who took the photos, and raise also questions about those who commissioned the images. This will be done by referring to classical questions of photo analysis concerning the men and maybe women behind the cameras. Another chapter will be about, as I call it, counter images or counter narratives of victims that will be based on testimonies of survivors and the their experiences with photography to show literally the other side of the picture. In this presentation, however, I will mainly focus on the chapter that deals with the photographs themselves that are the main sources of my project. The basic tasks of the identification departments in the camps resembled the work of identification departments of the police, meaning they were responsible for creating pictures and individual files of the prisoners after their arrival at the camp and keeping record of the living and dead camp inmates. Mugshot pictures were taken inside the barracks or rooms of the identification departments, such as these examples from the Auschwitz concentration camp. These standardized portraits were supposed to be taken of all registered prisoners. Deportees who were killed by the SS after their arrival, which was the majority, for instance, at the Birkenau camp, were not photographed. One of the photographers who took these pictures at Auschwitz was Wilhelm Brasse. Brasse was registered as a Polish political prisoner at Auschwitz and was forced to work at the identification department because he was a trained photographer before the German invasion. I actually had the privilege to meet Mr. Brasse several times in Poland, but unfortunately he passed away before I could interview him. However, other scholars recorded his testimonies in which he vividly described the horrendous and brutal scenery of taking these pictures. He would always emphasize the dehumanizing situation and the fear of those being photographed. After the liberation, he also refused to photograph ever again. Despite the dehumanizing and violent context of mugshots in concentration camps, these pictures are nowadays occasionally used to individualize the deportees. These mugshots are, for instance, very prominently used at the Auschwitz Memorial in an exhibition which is actually not far away where these pictures were originally taken. The switch in meaning and the appropriation of the SS photos started right after liberation. Furthermore, survivors sometimes reenacted these pictures and used them as memorabilia for their times in the camps. After liberation, some survivors took pictures that clearly resemble identification department mugshots. However, in comparison to actual SS photos, the former prisoners look much more self-confident and in some cases even proud, such as in this example, a photo of survivor Oskar Singer taken in liberated Theresienstadt by a Soviet female officer on May 10, 1945. The meaning and the function of the photos, in this case the identification photography, change and very much depend on the context of usage. The fact that the camp administrations and higher SS institutions created standardized identification departments inside their camps tells us something about continuations of police institutions inside concentration camps and the self-conception of the SS. In general, identification departments as police officers were first created in the 19th century as part of the emergence of the so-called scientific police work, meaning supposedly objective police work based on categorizing the population in clearly defined groups and models of social engineering. I argue that the photos produced in these camp departments must be understood in this tradition of creating evidence for the legality and the objectivity of its associated institutions, in this case the concentration camps. But to get back to the history of the SS photos. Besides the role for identification and categorization of deportees, these departments, the identification departments, served as the official photo studios in the respective camps, and the SS photographers who worked there were responsible for photographing in the camps in general. These pictures that were taken at the Mauthausen concentration camp by an SS photographer called Paul Ricken are part of a series of images that document the arrival of the first Soviet prisoners of war at Mauthausen. At this point, I want to give you an overview of the photographs taken by SS men in the identification departments that serve as the base of my study. Therefore, I will refer to groups of motives that I chose and that are based on earlier studies about the topic and that are also used in an analysis of photos from Mauthausen. I will show you a selection of images from various camps without going too much into detail. Towards the end of the presentation, I will contextualize one image more profoundly. So please feel free to interrupt me about specific pictures. I will otherwise not elaborate too much about each one of them. Since this is an overview of the photographs, for the sake of simplicity, photos which were taken in different contexts are treated together. For example, the mugshots and these pictures of Soviet prisoners of war share the motive prisoner, but they're obviously taken out of very different contexts. Whereas the first image resembles police photography, the first two, the second series correspond to racist depictions of human types that were very common in German photography, especially on the Eastern Front. But besides the racist aesthetic of these pictures, there is actually a whole series of them. You can still see the negative stripe, and these were actually not developed in the camps. But besides the racist aesthetic, they're highly problematic for another reason. Francisco Boix, a professional photographer and resistance fighter against fascism in Spain, who was forced to work as a prisoner at the Mauthausen concentration camp identification department, also because he was a professional photographer, commented on these photo series of Soviet POWs during the Nuremberg trials by stating that, I quote, "This was done only for the photographs, the reality was quite different." Boix points out that some of the Soviet POWs were photographed multiple times while conducting relatively easy work at the Mauthausen quarry. Shortly afterwards, they were murdered. Although these specific images are not preserved and their further usage is not documented, Boix's testimony highlights the importance to look for counter-narratives to these SS photos and the stories that they convey. Another common motive of SS photos is the concentration camp itself. Images of the camps often document working places of prisoners, meaning places of forced labor, such as these examples from the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück. These pictures show very clearly the staged character not only of the depicted scenes, but the photo album in general. The female prisoners seem to wait for the photo to be taken. The focus of the picture, the lighting and the depth are carefully prepared. The depicted women do not move and are rather part of the facilities. The emphasis is on their workforce rather on their suffering and fear as prisoners in a Nazi concentration camp. This seems obvious for someone who is familiar with the realities of Ravensbrück. However, this picture clearly does not illustrate that reality, especially when compared to descriptions of survivors of the same facilities in the camps. For instance, the huge and well-equipped camp kitchen, which is documented in this album as well, suggests a professional and sufficient providing of food. However, survivor testimonies, such as the one of Helen Klein, conducted by the Shoah Foundation, document the enormous lack of food, especially in these facilities. This example illustrates the importance of integrating survival testimonies in analysis of photos or photo albums created by perpetrators to understand the other side of the picture, that which was not photographed. Other photos show places of production in the camps without prisoners or guards visible, like the rabbit farms that were part of many concentration camps. These images are taken from a photo album that documents the breeding facilities of these rabbits in various camps. Although for contemporary viewers these images might seem irritating as visualizations of Nazi concentration camps, they do actually document camps during their existence in comparison to the first four photos that I showed. These examples drastically underline the dangerous potential of these visual sources if misused by so-called revisionists or Holocaust deniers, as to show the opposite what one might expect from Nazi concentration camps, cute bunnies instead of violence. Many pictures such as these were preserved in photo albums for different purposes. Especially in these cases, the line between official photography and private photography can be blurry. For instance, there are many images with a motive or that are associated with the motive SS events that were commissioned by the camp administrations, such as this promotion ceremony. This photo was actually hidden by a prisoner, but it was also preserved in a photo album of an SS guard. You see it on the left side. And there is even a mark on one of the SS men in the picture, so maybe this refers to the person who owned the photo album. This proves that individual SS men could occasionally receive photographs that were produced for and developed in the identification department's photo studios. These semi-private photos have a great potential to reconstruct the social and professional network of the SS. I refer here to Christoph Busch, Stefan Hödler, and Robert Jan van Pelt's impressive analysis of the so-called Höcker album, which consists of photos that were taken not far away from the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp complex. This photo, developed in Mauthausen, shows SS officers at the camp. In their middle, Franz Zierers, the commandant. The picture and many similar images are documents of the self-image of the perpetrators, the way they wanted to be remembered as manly soldiers doing their duty among comrades. After liberation, some photographs deliberately break the image of the strong and self-confident SS man. Charles Bobrow tells the story of these pictures of Commandant Zierers in an interview stored at the Shoah Foundation. The first photo on the left was taken after the capture of Zierers, when he was brought back to Gusen concentration camp, a sub-camp of Mauthausen. He tried to escape but was shot and injured. In Gusen, former prisoners and US Army personnel interviewed Zierers. What happened afterwards is not clearly documented. Probably he was handed over to survivors of the camp. The exact story of the picture of Zierers' corpse on the right cannot be reconstructed. However, the interview with Charles Bobrow proves that the photo was developed more than once and might have been handed out as a memorabilia during the first phase of liberation, when the former concentration camps were used as DP camps, displaced person camps, presumably as a satisfactory and maybe also reassuring document of proof of the death of a main perpetrator. However, this picture was not only used by liberators and survivors. The photo circulates on anti-Semitic websites as alleged evidence for the, as they claim, fake testimony of Zierers in connection with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Simon Wiesenthal, who was liberated by US troops in Mauthausen. An anti-Semitic montage of Wiesenthal is attached to the picture of the dead commandant, suggesting Wiesenthal's or the Jews' responsibility for the killing of Zierers and therefore covering up the reality of Mauthausen. This is one of many, many examples of the misuse of photographs and photography from concentration camps by Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites. It is of high significance to reflect on the dangers of these photos and the potential of misuse and deliberate misinterpretation, specifically when connected to Nazi crimes. The photos of the commandant, actually both of them, raise questions that need to be reflected when working with perpetrator sources and perpetrator pictures specifically. To what extent should we, as historians or as educators, use the self-image of perpetrators as illustrations, like these ones? And to what extent do these images reproduce an image that the perpetrators wanted to create of themselves? And therefore, how do these pictures distort the historical reality? Furthermore, should we use counter-images to these pictures? And should we use dehumanizing pictures, such as the photo of Zierers' corpse? In short, and this is a general question for my thesis, how do we visualize perpetrators today, and what stories we therefore tell about them? As you see, there is a wide variety of motives that were produced by perpetrators in concentration camps, ranging from mugshots, racist depictions of prisoners, seemingly objective documents of the camps, and portraits of perpetrators, and among many more. It is indicative to critically examine them and to not understand them as pure visualizations of the camp's history. So the value of these photos as historical documents needs to be evaluated. So why do I think it is important to analyze them? Let me introduce my own approach, actually personally and professionally. I worked as a guide at the Mauthausen Memorial, as was mentioned before, and these pictures are very prominently used at memorial sites as illustrations for the history of the camps. So, but besides what they actually show, there was not really a lot of knowledge about the context of the situations and what it actually shows. So I started to be interested in that and analyze photos in a very descriptive way for my MA thesis. But I'm now more interested in actually looking at the perspective of the SS photographers themselves, as I call it, the perpetrator's gaze that is manifested in these pictures. Meaning what these images were supposed to show and what the perpetrators had in mind by documenting these specific aspects of the camp's history. Concretely, I want to ask, what do these pictures tell us about the perspective of the perpetrators on their crimes? What images, meaning photographic images, but also ideological and mental images, did they want to create and convey? And by whom were they supposed to be seen? I'm interested in the ideological and practical aspirations of the SS that are connected to these pictures. Therefore, it is necessary to understand how these photos worked in their historical and cultural context. My approach is to answer these questions, besides classical historical research in archives and the analysis of written documents, connected to the identification departments by deciphering photographic genres, which the SS referred to, that set the visual framework for the representation of the concentration camps by the SS to different audiences. These genres illustrate the dialogue of the SS photos with other contexts, especially traditions of visualizations beyond the camps. The main sources will be photos from selected camps that reflect time periods and in the genesis of the Nazi camp system, in order to analyze developments and changes in the pictorial documentation of the camps by the perpetrators. My previous work on images from the Mauthausen camp suggests that the SS photographers directly or indirectly referred to common photographic genres in the pictures. For instance, identification photography, industrial photography, crime scene photography, police photography, anthropometric photography, and so on. I plan to decipher these genres used by the SS photographers by analyzing selected individual photos and series of images concerning their arrangement, the perspective of the photographer, and the aesthetic of the pictures. Methodologically, the photographs will be analyzed according to the so-called serial iconographic photo analysis. This, I will not go into detail in that. This methodology consists of two main parts: the systematic quantification of photographic collections and a qualitative analysis of representative images. In an additional step, this analysis will be complemented by questions concerning the position of the genres in their so-called economies of demonstration, meaning to investigate the place of these pictures in the complex process of their usage. I refer here to Amos Morris Reich's use of the term in his study about race and photography. Using this methodology, I will show that the deciphered genres highlight the functions that the SS wanted their photos to fulfill. My hypothesis is that photographs developed at the identification departments are not mere visualizations of the camps, but that they actually became parts of the crimes committed there. I want to show one photograph from a series of similar images that were taken by SS photographers at the Mauthausen concentration camp to underline this argumentation and to introduce my thoughts about an interpretation of SS photographs as genres. This is not a profound photo analysis, but rather an introduction into my approaches and first conclusions. This file excerpt shows the usual bureaucratic dealing with unnatural deaths, as they were called. The report about the shooting of Soviet prisoners of war German Pankratov was signed by SS law officer Karl Schulz on November 18, 1942, and transferred to the SS main economic and administrative office. In the procedure of administrating death cases, the job of the identification department, photographers, resembled the tasks of photographers who took pictures of crime scenes for the police. After a death case was reported, the SS photographers were supposed to go to the site and take pictures for the death case file. Most of these photos look very similar, some of them were even used multiple times. It is striking that the photograph actually contains very little information concerning the identity of the presumably dead person and the exact location of where it was taken. Two central aspects of crime scene photography. Furthermore, the cause of death cannot be reconstructed on the information the photo provides. These paradoxically anonymous identification photos were developed in the photographic laboratory of the identification department and later attached to reports that were then also sent to the SS and police courts in the respective bigger cities. There is no known case that was further substantially investigated. Pictures like the one discussed here are set in the genre of police crime scene photography. To be more precise, they look like photographs of this genre. However, by comparing this picture to actually contemporary crime scene photography, it becomes evident that the SS photos do not show any details of the killed person, of the environment, or possible clues that would question the SS account of the circumstances of death, which usually was stated as shot while trying to escape. The comparison emphasizes that the photos were not intended to investigate crimes, but rather to cover them up. These killings were murders that were camouflaged as escape attempts. Survivors of the camp testified that SS men did sometimes even move the position of corpses to make the scenes look more like unsuccessful escape attempts. This shows that the photographers wanted to create a very specific image. In contrast to actual police work that tries to find evidence, hopefully, which can be used in an investigation, the SS created evidence that would prove their story of the events. By photographing the scenes according to the genre of police crime scene photography, the SS men underlined the character of evidence of the photographs and therefore the validity of the reports. Furthermore, the photos prove that the SS wanted to create an image of their camps as being part of a modern legal system. The concentration camps were not realms outside of society or outside of the traditional legal system. On the contrary, the perpetrators did emphasize on the legality of their deeds by documenting and showing their camps according to judicial standards. The identification departments, as part of the representation of the police in the camps, were responsible for creating this image of legality. Although they seemed to function like ordinary identification departments, they fulfilled their tasks only in the interest of the SS. The photographs that they produced show this clearly. They were supposed to look like actual crime scene photos, but they actually do not fit the definition of the genre. It is important to point out that violence, a core element of the concentration camp system, is seldom documented in preserved SS photographs, precisely because of this purpose to create a legal image. However, my emphasis here is on the word preserved images, as survivor testimonies indicate that there was indeed a wider amount of photographs taken by SS men. For instance, Wilhelm Brasse, the Polish political prisoner and photographer that I mentioned before, remembered that he had to develop pictures, for instance, of Soviet prisoners of war that were murdered with axes in the camp. The strict regulations concerning photographs and photographed violence connected with the destruction of many visual sources by the perpetrators in the last stage of the war are probably the main reasons why these images are not preserved today. But maybe they're still in cellars in homes in Germany and Austria and will at one day be rediscovered. Due to this disappearance of photos of obvious violence, the pictures we have today document concentration camps usually as clean working facilities, often without any visible prisoners and certainly no violence, besides, again from the perspective of the perpetrators, legitimate shootings of escapees, so-called escapees, and official executions in concentration camps. The violence behind these pictures become visible only by integrating the perspective of survivors who themselves often were very aware of the lack of proper documentation of crimes. Therefore, some former camp survivors even reenacted the violence they experienced as documented in the following picture that was preserved by Buchenwald survivor Judith Becker and shown during her interview by the Shoah Foundation. In her interview, Judith Becker emphasizes that there was always someone hanging on the gallows at Buchenwald. However, probably due to a lack of evidence, these hangings were restaged right after liberation, and copies of the pictures were handed out to document the crimes committed by the SS. Immediately after the downfall of the Third Reich, survivors of the camps started to counter the narratives of the perpetrators manifested also in the pictures that visually erased the violence in the camps. I argued that we should take the attempts of the survivors to fight these distorting images seriously and integrate their stories in analysis of perpetrator sources more profoundly. To sum it up, I argue that the identification department photographs were used to create evidence for alleged escape attempts and murders, to cover up the terrible living conditions of deportees, and to create an image of professional businesses run by forced laborers. Therefore, these SS photos do not only constitute a one-sided view of the camps, but a concrete tool for the perpetrators used to cover up the violent realities of the camps. The seemingly paradox use of many of these images as a masquerade for the realities of the camps and as a proud documentation within the SS system is crucial to address in order to interpret the SS choices for certain genres. Consequently, those who commission the different types of photographs and their audiences are essential to deal with in order to find answers to the questions why there was a need to produce this fake evidence. My project is a plea for reflecting on the significance and potential of photos as historical sources. The SS photos show the dangers of uncritical usage of these perpetrator documents, not only by anti-Semites and revisionists who want to distort the truth, but also by creating a false image of the camp's reality by merely using them as authentic visualizations of victims' experiences. However, there are also unique sources themselves when critically examined, as should be the case with any historical document. They have, for instance, the potential to reconstruct the practical and ideological aspirations of the perpetrators by examining the links of photographic and mental images. Therefore, I hope that my project will contribute to perpetrator studies specifically by introducing survivor perspectives and new analytical ways of looking at SS pictures. I want to go beyond the frame of the perpetrators' cameras to rethink how the concentration camps are visualized and imagined, and therefore explore hitherto overlooked sources for and aspects of the camp's history. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we'll have the Q&A. Lucas, who would like to ask? Lucas, I'll let you follow.
So my question is about the audience, the intended audience, because so now you're saying that after the war and the Holocaust was over, it's become recycled and reused by anti-Semites. But given that the normative state, the court system, lawyers had no influence over the camps, why did they create images of the camps that would look legalistic? Like, who are they trying to convince, and why? Because presumably at the time they didn't think, well, or did they? We're going to lose the war, and we'll need these later. So who was it produced for?
I think it's very difficult to answer this question in general because it's very much connected to certain series of photos or genres of photos. So the identification photos in the beginning, the mugshots, they were used in the camp administration, and this was clearly a copy of police institutions. The idea behind that was to re-identify prisoners if they would escape. This was the main reason.
I could see the use for that. I think the thing that with the picture that I'm thinking of most in this case is the recreation of the crime scene photo without the information that would be necessary to actually use it to solve the crime. Because why recapitulate this genre if it is really not used at all in the way that that genre was developed to be used in police institutions? Like, why do it, and who's going to look at this Because the courts
Yeah.
wouldn't be like checking to see.
It depends on the courts, because there were also special SS courts, and my theory is that they produced them mainly for them because there were also a lot of checks and balance in the SS system. And there are also cases where certain SS officers were persecuted by their own SS comrades for different reasons, not because of inhumanity. It was sometimes argued with inhumanity, but there were often a lot of fights inside this organization. And as these camps were not outside of the legal system, I think it was more logical for them to create this fake evidence than to not do it. Also because the number of prisoners who were living and dead, they were documented, they were also known outside of the camp system. So there was a certain logic in justifying the disappearance of people, so to say, or the dying of people. I can't give definite answers because there's really a lack of documentation. There is a report of a capo, a prisoner functionary, about this process, but it's also a very subjective perspective. There is a testimony of 2 SS men who were involved in that, but they were only working in the camps. They were not responsible for how these reports were used afterwards. This is still a question which you need to answer. The problem in general with these photos is that there is really a lack of documentation because they show dead people, and I think this was also the main reason why they were destroyed in all the other places where they were sent to. So as far as I know at the moment, they were sent, like these reports were usually sent to 5 different institutions, the different courts, the police and so on, and in most of these institutions, these reports they don't exist anymore. I can't give a definite answer, but I would turn the question around. I think it was more logical for them to produce this evidence in their self-identity as a almost police force than to not do that.
I mean, but I think that's the interesting thing, which is like, the police all got wrapped up into them, but in a way, what you're saying, that they have to protect themselves against other people in the SS who might say that they're doing crimes, it goes against what I think is kind of the major narrative of the SS, which is like, it's a structure that's set up to incentivize more radical action, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe I speak to this.
Yeah.
So the problem is, if you have a body who is kind of creating a dynamic of violence, this dynamic can lead to violence which is not, goes beyond what they even expect, and you can't control this anymore. So this is an instrument of control. So you have to report about your violence so does it not get out of hand. So I think these are the mechanisms within this body of violence.
Yes.
Does this make some more sense?
It makes sense, I suppose, but I mean, why? Because I thought that the narrative of like why certain people like Heydrich can rise so fast, so quickly, so high so quickly, is because they're willing to be more radical than opponents, and that they can use that strategically in kind of intra-bureaucratic fights.
But I mean, I can't give a definite answer, but I would also agree with Wolf, and I think also that it depends on what prison groups you look at, on what camps you look at. I said very briefly that prisoners who were deported to camps, I mean, they were not actually prisoners, they were not photographed, for instance, and of course the mass extermination process was also not photographed. So it's more about registered prisoners in camps for whom they were seen as accountable for. So it's a specific aspect also. But I see a question on it.
Sorry, it's just also a comment on his question, was that I feel like another reason for like documentation, the way that you kind of flipped the question, is because the SS and the leadership was never really clear about the final solution to everyone in all ranks. So I feel like in order to maintain the idea that they had control over the situation, they produced these kinds of documents. It was
Yes, but it's also like these documents are also not so much connected to the final solution, like the mass extermination of Jews, because the main groups of prisoners in concentration camp were not Jewish. The Jews were supposed to be deported to extermination centers and to extermination camps, so there it was different. Maybe I should have made this more clear. I'm looking basically on the concentration camp system, not on the extermination camps. So I wouldn't look at the camps in Treblinka or in Belzec, and also Auschwitz-Birkenau is kind of a mixture. It's more about the standardized camp system that was not so much in the center of the Holocaust itself. So maybe I should have differentiated the terms a bit more clearly. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges and the limits of using survivor testimony as the counter evidence? Because I could see ways in which, okay, you know, there are pictures of food, and then you find testimony of people saying, you know, there was no food, or SS men are portrayed very, like, proudly, and you find testimony of cruelty of SS men. Like, how do you approach this without everything kind of becoming oversimplified, or what are some of the challenges of using testimony as counter evidence?
Well, I mean, the biggest challenge is that you need to find specific testimonies about specific situations, and this is usually not the case. So in the perfect scenario, I would find a testimony. I found some written testimonies about, for instance, photography in concentration camps, or how the SS tried to create a certain image of a camp or a situation, or how they presented the camps to visitors and so on. So these are, of course, the perfect sources. And then there are sources that describe certain aspects of the camps or certain places in the camps that were also supposed to be documented by the SS. So for instance, this kitchen example, again, this is not really an analysis yet. The SS really was proud of the kitchens. This has different reasons. I would suppose because these photo albums were often handed over to private enterprises, private businesses to start cooperations with concentration camps. So they wanted to create an image of a working facility that has everything on the highest modern standard. But on the other hand, if you look at the photos more carefully, you see, for instance, that the shower facilities, they don't have private rooms, which was very untypical for that time. So there are certain hints in the photographs themselves, but if you then watch survivor testimonies that actually show what these kitchens looked like, this creates a very different image. So I don't know yet exactly how I will use this in the photo analysis, but I think it's a very important aspect to integrate this perspective, because the photos themselves don't tell the story. So I need to kind of like find ways to link the photos with other sources. And again, this is like a big problem of my project in general, that there is really a lack of sources. So there are a lot of photos, but there is no background information. There is very seldom written documentation. There is almost no correspondence at where they were attached to. This was actually a rather rare example that I showed you. So there is really, I'm really looking for everything that I can find to contextualize the photos.
Well, actually, my question segues very nicely to what you just said. I noticed that these photos are coming from very disparate places, Wisconsin, there's Spanish.
Yeah.
So how did you find these?
It's very difficult. But usually the first address are memorial sites, because they use these photos in their pedagogical work. So they often already did a certain search for these images. And then there are a few studies that deal with these photos in a very broad way, and they already separated them in certain groups. I also made my own separation groups, and then I try to find representative images, and parallel to that I try to find sources that have never been used before. But this is usually not so much the case. I think there are certain groups of motives that were really standardized. This is also something why I chose, this is one reason why I chose these identification departments, is that it was really a standardized process. For instance, in concentration camps run by the Ustaša regime in Croatia, there was no, as far as I know, no regulations about photography, so there is not a clear corpus of photos, so to say. But I usually start with with memorial sites and the main archives in Germany, usually in the Bundesarchiv, and then I try to look for sources. But the photos are not so difficult to localize, actually, because they were used quite often in publications and educational projects. But some of them, you see then also which photos were usually chosen, usually the ones that look a bit more cruel. But it's also usually an interpretation, because sometimes it just looks cold. Like there's not really violence, but usually these photos are used. But then if you look at the others, they look very different.
Yeah. If I could just follow up really quickly. I want to see if I understood correctly that there are SS photographers, but there are also prisoner photographers.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So
can you talk about the different roles or how those two positions?
So the standard standardized concept of one of these departments was that there was 1 or 2 SS photographers that ran this workshop, and then a group of prisoners who were professional photographers who would assist. De facto, they did all the technically important work, like developing the pictures. They would take care of the cameras, of the negatives, and so on. And the SS photographers would get a training program to understand how a camera works, basically, and also certain training in how to make photos. But then they would also get regulated. They're documented almost. These are the documents I'm actually looking for. There were regulations and requests from high SS institutions to these departments to photograph certain aspects of the camps. So it was also not that they would just run around and make random photos. They would get a certain task to do something, and these tasks were usually sent out to all camps. So this was really a standardized process. And then they would send these files up the hierarchy again. On the other hand, there are a lot of hints to that, a lot of photography besides this official photography, but usually they are not preserved. And they're only documented by the prisoners who worked there and who had to develop them. So they would tell the story of photographs that you can't see anymore. There was a question.
That was sort of one of my questions, that they had these groups of SS photographers where they're required to put reports up, and are there any photographs in there that you found?
I'm sorry.
Okay. You said there are SS groups in the camps. I'm wondering, because Germans are so well known for their organization and their reporting, was there reporting that was going on that was required of people running the camps to show they were running it in a certain way, and are those available?
Yeah, there are correspondences about, there is documentation like that, but these identification departments, they were actually, I didn't mention it, but they were part of a bigger department, which was called the political department, and this was basically the representation of the Gestapo in the camps. So they were there to also check on the SS, although they were also SS men. So it was, if you look at it from the distance, it looks very structured and, so to say, German in that way, but if you look closer, it didn't work like that. And it was very confused, very chaotic. Often they didn't really know to whom they should report to. So on the one hand, there was this structure. On the other hand, I wouldn't rely on it so much. Also, I think a lot of orders were just oral orders. So I think there is also just a lack of documentation because there never was a written documentation.
Yeah, I want to come back to Paul's question to the prisoner photographers.
Mm-hmm.
So can you elaborate a little? Do you have some documentation? For example, you mentioned, and I thought this was very striking, that photography was part of the crime.
Yeah.
Or became part of the crime. So if prisoner photographers had to take photos or develop photos, they were actually committing crimes in your perspective. In a way, I think I agree with that. But do you see a kind of a room for maneuver for them to also resist the execution of these crimes?
Mm.
I'm asking this because one of my PhD candidate just did work on Jewish prisoner physicians, and there is this kind of change between execution of crimes and also resistance.
Yes. I would say that there is also kind of a lack of documentation of these prisoner photographers, but always when I found documents, they always tried to resist in one way or the other, precisely because they understood what was going on, maybe even more than the SS photographers. Because they were trained in that field, they also understood how photos can distort an image, and they physically saw these images all the time. So many of these photographs were actually hidden by prisoners in the camps, specifically from these departments, or taken right after liberation, so they would then just walk into these departments and try to find everything which was still there. Or they would refuse to burn the images. So in Auschwitz, for instance, there was also the order to burn all photographs, and the prisoners did it very, very slowly. And at some point, the SS guards just ran away, and they tried to save everything which was in there. So I think I would argue that especially amongst these prisoners, there was a high potential of resistance. And in Mauthausen, the case that I know from my previous work, the whole department was basically a resistance group, also because it was a group of Spaniards, and they just came from the Civil War, so they also understood how to work together as an underground group. So there was a lot of awareness, I would say, among the prisoners. And the SS kind of underestimated this also, I think. 1, 2, 3.
photographs that otherwise haven't been taken or preserved. And I'm wondering, as you were going through testimony, did you come across, was there any, because I know a lot of survivors in the archive became artists or wrote or drew or painted about their experiences. I wonder, are there other representations of their experience that otherwise weren't captured by SS photography that you think would fit into your project? Like, would you be interested in incorporating, for instance, visual art that survivors made that they felt reflected an aspect of camp experience that's not reflected in these perpetrator-produced photographs?
It's exactly in the direction which I want to go now. Like, this is also something, one of the conclusions from the interviews I saw so much, that there is really a need to show something that would represent their experience. And this actually really fits this definition of counter images that I have so far. So I will definitely integrate this much more. And this is also one of the main things that I found. And this reenactment is just one part of it, I think. I was just showing these images now because they really refer to certain scenes in the camps. But I think visual art by prisoners can really open up, so to say, this perspective. Yeah. So
I was just wondering if that addresses the behavior but really gender is very broad in the way that we can lens through the lens of the
yes.
on objects or confession of masculinity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, definitely. I didn't elaborate on this so much because I'm still looking for female SS associates who made photos to have a comparative possibility. But I think especially the photos of the self-image of the perpetrators really shows this manly image of perpetrators and how they wanted to be remembered. And I think this will also be a chapter of my that I haven't written yet. So. But this definitely, I think, plays a huge role because it's really part of the self-representation as a manly organization. I'm curious if there are any differences also in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, because it was for female prisoners, and I'm going to be there next year. So I'll try to kind of integrate this in that. But I would definitely say that it's a very gendered perspective, this perpetrator's case, and a male perpetrator's case.
So victims, and how the victims are.
Yes. Especially Soviet prisoners of war and Jews who were often feminized in the way how they were documented. So it's a big thing.
I have a question, and maybe it relates back to the points about perpetrator photographers and photographers, but it's about the professional formation of the photographers. Do you have any documentation of what their different professional formations are, and if you're going to use these different genre lenses, like crime photography, etc., maybe it's worth thinking about that in relation to the professional formation. Like, were any of them actually police photographers, or is the genre getting filtered through kind of like how crime scenes are portrayed in sort of tabloid press, and were they coming from press photography, or were they amateurs, and this is kind of their idea that they get through the press of these different genre formats?
I think, and in general, I mean, it's a bit hard actually to find. That was surprising for me. It is also about the German documentation. They didn't really document who was working in these identification departments. They would have lists of SS officers who would work in the general department, but often not about this department. But that doesn't really make a difference because usually they don't have any background in photography. They're very, very rarely they have any background. They have a certain training, or they might have professions that you could interpret as qualified. So, but they were not professional. But on the other hand, there's one. I was wondering exactly about the same. So how maybe they were just not. Maybe they just didn't know how to make these photos. But there is one series of photos that really documents a shot person, a shot prisoner in Sachsenhausen, very professionally, very, very professionally. And I was wondering why this one prisoner was really, like, this case was really documented as it should have been. And the point was that it was one of the sons of Joseph Stalin that they shot. And after they shot him, they found out who he was. So they were obviously extremely scared that they might get into trouble because it was actually a political hostage. So suddenly they understood how to make it. So I think I mean, I can't say talk about all of them, but I think if they would have wanted to, they could have done it much more professionally. And this case kind of showed, at least in Sachsenhausen, they would have been able to do it. And there are also reports that they documented this crime scene. I mean, it was a crime scene. Right after it happened. So obviously also the people who worked there could have done it differently. Yeah.
What was your research methods, and did you travel to Germany, Israel, and Russia for your research?
So the methodology I use is the serial iconographic photo analysis, which is intended to do basically what I want to do, to have like a huge amount of photos, because there are thousands of photos, and then to try to establish categories with which you can choose representative images. So to make it short, first I have certain categories that are already established and that I also trust, and I can also argue that they're basically the categories that are at least the big categories of photographs, and then I would choose photographs that would share certain elements of these categories and would put them in a list and kind of like transform them into a text, and then there is a 4-step analysis to find representative images and then to choose a few that would represent this base of sources. So this is like the methodology for the photos. And the main problem with this is, but this is also part of the methodology, that you can never be sure how representative they actually are, because they're always connected to certain and often very specific stories of how they were preserved. But this is just something I can't really change. So I thought that this is the most profound methodology that exactly fits this problem, to have a huge amount of sources, the need to somehow categorize them, and then to find representative images, and then to analyze them as representative images. And it's always also adapted to the certain series of photographs. So, for instance, of course, the mugshot photographs, they're very different to analyze than the photos that show the camps as industrial complexes. Yes.
Did you travel to Russia, Germany, Israel?
Germany, Austria, Israel, in the States a bit. And the next steps are Czech Republic. And Spain. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. I mean, actually, I will also integrate Auschwitz-Birkenau, because it was this mixture of extermination camp and concentration camp. The reason why I don't focus on it so much is because there is this one study about the Höcker album that I mentioned before, and they're really going into details about Auschwitz. So I think I will, although they have a different approach, it's still like I will probably go in another direction. But I will mention, because of this, there were these prisoners who secretly took photos very close to the extermination facilities, but I didn't find any new evidence about that. I actually talked to someone from the Sonderkommando and asked him also about that. I mean, he died unfortunately already, but I think what they probably did was that they got the camera from one of the so-called transports of arrivals, and then they hid it and took these photos, and then they were in contact with different resistance groups in the camp, and they would try to hand it over to a non-Jewish resistance group, because they again had contacts with the resistance group outside of the camp, and this was kind of like the idea how they would. But also because the people who were involved in that didn't survive, I don't think. And to be honest, I'm not sure if there will be any more information coming out at some point. There is one similar case in Ravensbrück, in a female prisoners camp. There's an article being published about it at the moment, about female prisoners who also secretly took photos. They would photograph their legs, because medical experiments were conducted on their legs. So they would try to get out of the barracks and make photos and get in again. And this already illustrates a major problem. It was not extremely difficult, it was not impossible to get a camera, But the problem is how to make a photo and how to develop it. And one of the main issues was the light. And this was also with the Sonderkommando photos. They couldn't make photos in the gas chambers because this was probably what they intended. So they had to wait for a time period when they would burn corpses outside of the gas chambers because there weren't too many people being murdered. So they took these pictures. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much.